What's up guys, and in today's video I'm going to be going through how I'm actively overcoming temporary defeat, what is the difference between temporary and permanent defeat as well, and how I leverage defeat in order to rise to the next level. So like always with these videos, the mission is to show our builds raw and real, to show you the good, the bad, the ugly, what it is that I'm actively implementing in terms of mental models, and actively scaling those mental models into the future. Also just solving what hurts within businesses and organizations, just coming in and being the chief problem solver and building back-end infrastructure for them. And also just to call in visionaries, basically people that understand what it is that is our mission, and ultimately just to build a network of cool people doing cool things at the same time. So like always, I like to break it down into 5 steps, which is 5 ways that I bounce back stronger, which is super important. I'm really excited to talk about this. This is going to be such a fun one, and I think in every stage that you go through, you're obviously just going to face defeat, and differentiating the two between temporary and permanent defeat is super valuable because it ultimately just allows you to strip away everything and ultimately realize that, hey, this is temporary defeat and I'm going to come back stronger and ultimately just rise to the next level. So number one being embrace the setback. It's your teacher. Ultimately just understanding that, hey, each and every setback ultimately is a teacher of a lesson. It's ultimately up to you to realize that, hey, there's a pattern or there's a lesson within this failure or temporary defeat of which that I need to understand in order to rise to the next level, and saying, hey, setbacks don't break you, they shape you. They ultimately are forges into who you are, and ultimately just understanding that, hey, each and every setback that you may think is a permanent defeat, and ultimately saying, hey, no, this is not a permanent defeat, this is temporary defeat, and this is how I'm actively just gonna put strategies in place in order to rise to the next level, because temporary defeats are, they happen most of the time, and ultimately they're there to shape you. Especially if you're doing the world of just building things, you're gonna face a lot of backlash and also temporary defeat in various shapes or forms, and ultimately just understanding that hey, you need to ultimately be accountable, and you need to ultimately understand that temporary defeat is a part of the game. You never accept it. Ultimately just saying, hey, for me, I'm personally never gonna accept temporary defeat. I may feel it in the moment, but ultimately just having measures in place that ultimately realign who I am and make me focus back on, hey, this is not permanent, and I need to make sure that I'm actively just building against that and saying, hey, I'm actively doing this. Is Flu knocked me out. I recorded 3 videos from just building, from just buildings, literally just building, and Flu knocked me out. But I was just like, you know what? I'm not gonna stop. I'm just gonna make sure that I get this done each and every single day, and just output the result. The result is the most important thing, and just focusing on that and saying, hey, each and every setback is a lesson. How can you bounce back? Because I know for a fact, for me at least, just ultimately bouncing back from those setbacks has ultimately allowed me to reach the next level in every single facet of my life and my personal life, and also just ultimately just leading people and teaching people as well, because those lessons that you learn from that time that you face temporary defeat, you can ultimately translate that to other people that ultimately are facing it in the current present moment in time, which I think also ties back to the big picture vision, which is inspiring millions of people, which is one of the main goals that I like to speak to you about, and saying, hey, overall, we want to make sure that we're inspiring millions of people, and that is the mission of Killer Chaos OS. But yeah, enough of that, and just get back into this and saying, hey, instead of forcing output, I rethought my outreach, came back sharper, ultimately saying, hey, instead of just ultimately understanding that, hey, my outreach was lacking simply because I was knocked out by Flu, I realized, hey, I need to rethink everything, and I ultimately need to come back sharper, and saying, hey, this temporary defeat ultimately got me down for a day or two, but now that I'm back, I have more clarity that I can now translate into what it is that I'm doing in terms of outreach. Even just recording these videos, just having and coming back with clarity ultimately just unlocks a new level. And this is just my own personal thought that, each and every time I get super excited to know that, hey, even though I feel this way in terms of temporary defeat, I know I'm going to rise above it, and ultimately that is going to be a story within my journey that I'm going to be able to share, and also help others that are currently experiencing that temporary defeat phase of their life, and ultimately saying, hey, I like to think of this as what is the daily move that I can make within myself. I like to say, hey, think back to your last war, the last time that I faced temporary defeat, and ask, hey, what was it trying to teach me? And just realizing that pattern, that each and every single temporary defeats you face, ultimately there is a pattern, and you ultimately just need to understand that. Like Albert Einstein says, the quote is, a fool is a person that does the same thing over and over again, but expecting a different result. And ultimately, how do you expect a different result if you're ultimately just doing the same thing, and ultimately realizing the pattern that is happening with what it is that you're doing ultimately allows you to reach to the next level. At least I found it to be true for me and what it is that we're building in Killer Chaos OS. So saying, hey, for example, let's say we make a build process, and then understanding that build process, we implement certain mental models and frameworks, but ultimately we realize at the end of the project that, hey, these mental models didn't work, and then we ultimately just say, hey, how are we going to learn from that, and ultimately just implement different strategies and processes that we implement into the next project, so that we ultimately just are constantly refining Killer Chaos OS and making it the best possible service that we can possibly make it, and then just constantly just pushing the needle forward. And that is the most important thing. But also just asking the key question of saying, hey, what's the one lesson your last setback gave you? Ultimately, just pattern recognition in terms of the lessons. What are the lessons that you're actively learning from your failures, or things that you may think are permanent defeats? And ultimately, just using those as leverage in order to build better and to scale better. And this is one of the reasons why I like to speak more about the mental models part when I say, hey, it's just to build mental models and how we scale those mental models into the future, because we know that into the future we're going to be wrong a lot of the times, but ultimately, just the few times that we do get it right, we need to make sure that we are on the nail, and we're just hitting the nail where we need to hit it, and just are super dialed in. And I think that's super important, which also leads into the second point, which is separate defeat from failure. Mindset is key. I think the most important thing here is mindset, and saying, hey, defeat is temporary, failure is quitting. I don't quit. No matter what happens, I know for a fact that I will never quit in everything that I do. I know for a fact that I will never quit. I will do my best to ultimately just make sure that it works. Even if I have to pivot, I think pivoting is often a good thing, and understanding that, hey, pivoting is not quitting, it's finding a new entry in order to reach the same goal. And I think this is super important. Just having that mindset of, I will never quit no matter what, ultimately just allows you to then push even harder, even more, and ultimately just allow you to just get closer to the overarching goal. Because mindset is so key, and training your mindset each and every single day to say, hey, this is the big picture vision, I see it, and no amount of failure or no amount of defeats is ultimately going to stop me from getting there. And ultimately just doing that ultimately allows your mind to be unlocked and ultimately see pathways to get there. Even when you face defeat, you know that, hey, your moral compass, or who you are, is ultimately aligned with this big picture vision, and that little kid, or at least that little inner voice in you, will ultimately just say, hey, don't stop, don't ever stop, because this is why you dreamed of building this big picture vision. And you need to make sure that you're making your younger version of yourself proud, and ultimately just keep pushing the needle forward, and saying, hey, how I'm doing this is, a deal fell through, I doubled down on DMs, booked a new opportunity instead. Saying, hey, each and every opportunity that comes, we need to make sure that we're super dialed in terms of creating more opportunities, and just ultimately becoming the most valuable person in the room. I'm super bullish on this, to say, hey, even if you face defeat, you need to make sure that you're the most valuable person in the room, because when you're the most valuable person in the room, you ultimately just attract opportunities. And just ultimately taking that into consideration, that, hey, you may have failed in XYZ, but another opportunity may come that's even 10 times bigger. And just ultimately just keeping that mindset of saying, hey, I need to be the person in the room that is the most valuable. And it's okay if you're not, but ultimately just having that mindset of, I want to constantly push the needle forward, and ultimately just become the person that's the most valuable person in the room, and ultimately just use that as a mindset tool to also just allow you to then push to the next level. At least I found that to be true, at least for myself. And saying, hey, what is the daily move that you could do? Which is, when something flops, take one small step. So ultimately saying, hey, if something flops, flops, you can bounce back. Just take one step at a time. I think that saying just take it a step at a time is super crucial, because you're not gonna just jump straight into it. You're ultimately gonna have to just rebuild, and that's okay. Just take one small step and ultimately just pace yourself, and you'll ultimately get there. And you'll even, most likely, at least I've found, is that you'll even land up being 10-20 steps ahead than where you were when you fell, quote unquote, fell off. But you ultimately just need to have the mindset aspect, which is super important, because if you don't have that, how do you expect to come back? And I think mindset is super key to say, hey, no matter what happens, I'm gonna bounce back no matter what. And we're just gonna cook with a team as well. We're just gonna absolutely cook. And I think this is super important. And then asking the key question of saying, hey, what's the one move you can make to turn into what's the one move you can make to turn defeat into a win? Ultimately understanding that, hey, things happen and that's okay, but how do I flip this on its head in order to create leverage and ultimately turn this into a win? Say, hey, you lost a deal. Okay, cool. That means you need to dial in on your outreach plan. You need to look at your outreach strategies, how you're actively sourcing clients, and how you're actively doing your pitch deck, and then ultimately saying, hey, maybe this is why we didn't get this client, because our positioning and our messaging wasn't as accurate, and we weren't really super dialed on our client avatar. And ultimately just understanding that allows you to then repivot and then ultimately say, hey, we're going to reach out again, we're going to fix this, and we're going to reach out again, and then the deal might be 10-20x what you lost. And ultimately just saying, hey, we're gonna win no matter what, and ultimately we're just gonna take the steps in order to make sure that we have the best possible chance at success. But the mindset aspect is super important in that. And then ultimately saying, hey, build systems that bounce back with you. I think this is my favorite thing to talk about, just systems in general, to say, hey, no matter what you do, you need to have systems and measures in place that ultimately bounce back with you. By this I mean saying, hey, systems give you momentum even when your mind's foggy, to say, hey, even if you fail in XYZ, you're backed up by your systems and mental models and frameworks that you're actively using, because you never lose that. You may lose the battle, but you haven't lost the war, and the war is the one that you need to win. And ultimately you need to keep that in mind, to say, hey, if I lost the battle, how do I come back? But not only with myself, but how do I give myself the best possible chance at bouncing back through systems as well? Also, just gives you that aid. At least I found that, hey, you need to have systems and measures in place that ultimately bounce back with you, because when you do bounce back, you can just understand that, hey, I'm bouncing back, but I'm not alone. I have a team behind me. I have processes and strategies in place that will ultimately allow me to reach 10x the level, and ultimately just allow you to then saying, hey, I'm gonna bounce back, but I'm gonna reach a completely different level, purely because I have myself and I also have the systems as well. And saying, hey, how I'm doing this is I built lead scoring in Airtable, and if one deal flops, another one is ready. Ultimately saying, hey, we have a system for lead scoring. If one deal flops, we ultimately have a backup that ultimately just creates more opportunities, so that we just keep the pipeline filled, which is super important, because if you don't have a pipeline, you ultimately are gonna just struggle when a deal doesn't go through. And ultimately just understanding that and saying, hey, what is the daily move that I could make on a day-to-day basis, which is automate a small system this week, follow up, scoring, lead scoring, or outreach. Just ultimately just automate the process that ultimately allows you to focus on high leverage work and ultimately just get the job done, and just focusing on systems that build with you, that grow with you in case you fail or you feel temporary defeat. And just ultimately just understanding that, I think, is super key. And then asking the key question of what's one system that keeps you moving even when you're low. Ultimately saying, hey, you may fail in terms of not getting a client, but if you have a strategy in terms of, you have a system in place that ultimately actively gets you more leads coming through, you ultimately are not struggling, because you ultimately have leads coming through and you have more opportunities. So you're less likely to say, hey, my world is ending simply because I lost a deal, because you have that mindset as well to say, hey, we have the systems, we have the processes that are ultimately just going to keep flooding our inboxes, but we need to make sure that we have the systems that grow with you, rather than just leaning or just having all your eggs in one basket per se, and then ultimately just keeping that in mind, which ultimately leads to leveraging your network, which is super powerful. And I think most people, at least from what I found, in terms of when they asked the billionaires, I mean, when they asked if you lost everything today, would you make it back? And most of the case, at least I've seen, is they say yes with 1,000% conviction. And they also mention that, hey, it's because of their network. And I think your network is your net worth, ultimately saying, hey, bounce back faster together with the people around you. Because if you have entrepreneurial friends that are making 8, 9 figures and you ultimately lose everything, you ultimately have access to that pool and ultimately bring in opportunities and ultimately allow you to then bounce back. You may not bounce back to like where you were before, but you ultimately have that leverage in terms of bouncing back quicker and ultimately saying, hey, solo grind is slow. Ultimately, just working by yourself is super slow. Your tribe accelerates your recovery. Ultimately, saying, hey, if you're doing every single thing, every moving part by yourself, it's super slow ultimately. But ultimately, understanding that, hey, if you have people around you that have the same vision and clarity of what it is that they want to shape their lives and want to build out for themselves, you're able to recover much quicker and you're also just able to just build that network. And I think it's super important to ultimately just build that network because that accelerates your recovery in a way that you never thought was possible until you actually experience it. And saying, hey, how I'm doing this is I had a rough week, so then I ultimately messaged my network group, and then one tweak replies up, ultimately saying, hey, I'm not gonna know every single thing by myself, but I have people or I have a network of group of people that have different skill sets, and ultimately saying, hey, if it was a rough week in terms of outreach, then I contact one XYZ friend in terms of outreach and saying, hey, like, how's it going with you guys? I'm having this problem, and ultimately asking questions ultimately allows you to recover quicker because they can tell you that, hey, increase or change your messaging in terms of your subject lines or your positioning or things like that because they ultimately have skin in the game and they're actively just winning as well, which ultimately allows you to win as well. And I think that is super important. And then ultimately, I think having the daily move of saying, hey, DM one person in your network for insight on a current block. So one problem that you're actively facing today, just network or just ask someone that's within your network, and then ultimately just allow them to give you advice and show you that, hey, XYZ is what is happening, and this is what I usually think of or do on a day-to-day basis to ask, hey, how can I actively do this, or just thinking about this and saying, hey, what is a key question that I could ask here, which is, hey, who can help you rise faster than you could alone? Ultimately saying, hey, you need to make sure that you have a network of people that ultimately allow you to then rise faster than alone, which ultimately just allows you to just continue pushing the needle forward and just continue just moving to the next level and facing adversity at its finest, but saying, hey, we're facing adversity and that's okay, but we have strategies and measures in place to give us the best possible chance at success if temporary defeat does strike in every facet, so that we just constantly are backed up in that and then we don't have to face it, and it's not just us facing it alone, that we can also just get people that also are aligned to ultimately just help us and saying, hey, the biggest thing is ultimately tying it back to the vision, which I always like to talk about in the final point, because it's all nice and rosy that I speak about all these things, but I think just tying it back to the vision, the big picture vision, is the most important thing to say, hey, why this matters is that temporary defeat temporary pain becomes permanent fuel, ultimately just allowing you to have that permanent fuel to say each and every single day that I need to make sure that we're pumping and just pushing the needle forward. At least I found to say, hey, I need to embrace temporary defeat and it's okay. I'm just gonna push the needle forward and I don't even care what anyone else says. I'm just constantly just gonna keep on refining my process because those are data points. Temporary defeat is data points, and those data points ultimately allow you to refine and come back sharper and stronger. And also just create that permanent fuel to say, hey, when we face temporary defeat, we need to embrace it and we need to actively just attack because this is what we're gonna face. It's all part of the game, and just actively just being a lifelong learner as well ultimately helps that. At least I found, and at least I found for myself. And saying, hey, how I'm doing this is chaos birthed predictive alerts. So now it's a core chaos OS feature to ultimately say, hey, we're actively building XYZ. This is how we're doing it, and ultimately just understanding how we are actively implementing it as well, and saying, hey, what is the daily move that I could be making, which is write down your legacy vision. So what is your ultimate chief goal, and saying, hey, tie to today's loss into tomorrow's win. So tie today's loss into tomorrow's win, ultimately saying, hey, we need to make sure that we're tying today's loss into tomorrow's win, because it's a brick in the foundation for what it is that we need to do, or the person that we need to become in order to reach that big picture vision. And then say, hey, what is the key question, which is, how does defeat push you closer to your mission? Ultimately just asking that, hey, how does the temporary defeat ultimately push us closer to our mission, and just make sure that each and every single day we're hitting the nail in the wall and just constantly refining our process and also building better, because defeat is going to happen in every facet of your life. It's just how you combat that through strategies and how you handle the mindset aspect as well, because the mindset aspect is super important. If you're gonna win, you need to have your mindset super dialed. And I know that into the future we're gonna face a lot of temporary defeats, even times where we may think it's permanent defeat, but it's temporary. Most of the case, all the things that you face is temporary defeat. Like Jeff Bezos said in the Lex Friedman podcast, that hey, make sure that the decisions that you're making, or understand that the decisions that you're making are either one door decisions or different doors. Like you can go and then come back through those doors. I'm probably butchering it, but yeah, I hope you get the point, that hey, if you go through one door you can come back, or if you go through another door you can't come back. Just making sure that we're actively implementing different decisions for different cases and actively just scaling those into the future. Like I said, I'm a big believer on temporary defeat, because I think temporary defeat is super important in your journey, and I am one of those guys that say, hey, temporary defeat is one of the biggest blessings that I could possibly ask for, because it ultimately means that I'm growing as a person and I'm actively just pushing to the next level. And I know that no matter what temporary defeat does come, we're ultimately just going to be able to push through that, and I back myself to make sure that hey, I'm actively just leading the team correctly, that hey, even though if we fail, we're ultimately gonna come back sharper and stronger than ever before, and just constantly just keep pushing the needle forward. And I'm super bullish on this. I know that we will get some stuff wrong into the future. We're still in the trenches, and that's okay. But ultimately, just understanding this, I know that into the future, we're gonna build better mental models. We're gonna scale those mental models, and we're gonna build cool stuff as well. And that is the most important thing. And inspiring millions of people. I think that is one of the biggest things, to be able to say, hey, Killer Chaos OS, or what it is that we're building, ultimately was the foundation, and then we scaled that up into the future, and then we inspired millions of people. I think that would be a big picture vision that is super exciting to wake up to, and why I'm excited to wake up each and every single day to build Killer Chaos OS, and just constantly just helping people and just serving people. I think that's the most important thing, and just figuring stuff out. I think that's one of the things that we're super dialed in, and just constantly just keeping on pushing the needle. But yeah, enough rambling about that. If you guys enjoyed the video, make sure to connect with me on X, LinkedIn, Instagram, and leave a comment if you guys have any questions, and then I will get back to you ASAP. And if you guys would like this video, make sure to just hit me up anywhere. Yeah. And if you guys yeah, so I'll see you guys in the next video.